Princess Anne walked through the grand corridors of Buckingham Palace with her usual confident stride. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting golden patterns on the marble floors she had known since childhood. At 73, she remained the hardest-working member of the royal family, attending more engagements than any other royal. Her dedication to duty was legendary, and her no-nonsense approach had earned her respect both within the palace walls and among the British public. Today was different, though. Today, she was supposed to attend an important meeting in the Queen's chamber, a private room where the most sensitive royal matters were discussed. This wasn't just any meeting. It was about the future direction of the monarchy under her brother Charles's reign. As the king's only sister and one of his closest advisors, Anne expected to play a crucial role in these discussions. As she approached the ornate doors of the chamber, she noticed something unusual. Two palace guards stood positioned directly in front of the entrance, their faces stern and unwavering. Anne had never seen guards posted at this particular door during family meetings. Something felt wrong. "Good morning," Anne said to the guards, expecting them to step aside as they always did. Instead, they remained firmly in place. "I'm sorry, Your Royal Highness," one of the guards said respectfully but firmly. "We have been instructed that you are not permitted to enter this morning." Anne's eyebrows raised in surprise. In all her years as a working royal, she had never been denied access to any royal meeting. "I beg your pardon, there must be some mistake. I am expected in this meeting." The second guard shifted uncomfortably but held his position. "I'm afraid our orders are clear, ma'am. No exceptions." Anne felt a surge of confusion mixed with growing anger. Who could have possibly given such an order? Charles would never bar her from an important royal discussion. They had worked closely together for decades, especially since their mother's death. As children, they had been close, and as adults, they had maintained a strong working relationship built on mutual respect and shared dedication to the crown. "Who gave you these orders?" Anne demanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent a lifetime in service to the crown. The guards exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "We cannot say, Your Royal Highness. We were simply told that these were the king's wishes." Anne stood there for a moment, processing this information. The king's wishes? That made no sense at all. Just yesterday, Charles had personally asked her to attend this meeting. He had emphasized how important her input would be, particularly regarding the modernization plans they had been discussing for months. Behind the closed doors, she could hear muffled voices. She recognized her brother's voice, deep and measured as always. But there was another voice, too, one that made Anne's stomach tighten with understanding. It was Camilla's voice, clear and commanding, seeming to dominate the conversation. Anne had always maintained a cordial relationship with Camilla, recognizing her importance to Charles's happiness. But she had also noticed subtle changes since Camilla became queen consort. There had been small shifts in protocol, gentle pushes toward decisions that seemed to benefit Camilla's vision for the monarchy rather than the institution itself. Standing outside those doors, listening to voices that grew more animated, Anne began to piece together what might be happening. The meeting was clearly proceeding without her, and from what she could hear, major decisions were being made. Decisions that would affect not just the immediate royal family, but the entire future of the British monarchy. Anne had dedicated her entire life to the crown. She had sacrificed personal desires, endured public scrutiny, and worked tirelessly to support the institution that her mother had served for 70 years. The idea that she was now being excluded from crucial discussions about that same institution felt like a betrayal of everything she had worked for. She turned away from the doors, her mind racing with questions and concerns. This wasn't just about being excluded from one meeting. This felt like something much more significant. If Camilla was indeed behind this exclusion, what did it mean for the future of the royal family? What other changes might be coming that Anne wouldn't be consulted about? As she walked back through the corridors, Anne's trained eye noticed other subtle changes around the palace. Staff members who used to greet her warmly now seemed more reserved. Certain longtime advisors appeared to be missing from their usual posts. Even the arrangement of flowers in the main hall seemed different, more elaborate and formal than the understated elegance that had been the palace's signature for decades. Anne realized that while she had been focusing on her royal duties and public engagements, significant changes had been happening within the very heart of the monarchy. Changes that she was apparently no longer considered important enough to be informed about, let alone consulted on. The princess made her way to her private office, her mind already formulating a plan. She had not survived decades in the royal spotlight by being passive or easily discouraged. If something was happening that could affect the institution she had served faithfully her entire life, she was determined to find out what it was and why she was being pushed aside. Little did she know that her brother Charles was completely unaware of her exclusion from the meeting, believing that his sister had simply been delayed by other royal duties. The truth about who had orchestrated her removal from this crucial discussion would soon become clear, but the damage to the royal family's unity had already begun. Anne spent the rest of that morning in her office, making discreet phone calls to trusted contacts throughout the palace. What she discovered disturbed her deeply. Over the past several months, while she had been busy with her packed schedule of royal engagements, a quiet revolution had been taking place within the royal household. Several longtime staff members had been quietly reassigned or encouraged to take early retirement. New faces had appeared in key positions, many of them people who had previously worked in Camilla's household during her time as the Duchess of Cornwall. The changes had been implemented gradually, so gradually that even someone as observant as Anne had failed to notice the pattern until now. Her longtime private secretary, Margaret, knocked gently on the door and entered with a tea tray. Margaret had served the royal family for over 20 years and knew Anne's moods better than almost anyone. "Your Royal Highness," Margaret said carefully, setting down the tea. "I hope you don't mind me mentioning this, but I received a rather unusual call this morning. Someone from the Queen Consort's office contacted me to ask about your schedule for the next several weeks." Anne looked up sharply. What kind of information were they seeking? "They wanted to know about all your upcoming engagements, particularly the private meetings and family functions. When I asked why they needed this information, they said it was for coordination purposes, but it felt odd. I've never had such a request before." Anne felt her suspicions growing stronger. "What did you tell them?" "I gave them only the information that's already publicly available," Margaret replied. "But Your Royal Highness, there's something else. I've been hearing whispers from other staff members. Apparently, there have been several meetings in recent weeks where your name was specifically mentioned as someone who might be resistant to necessary changes." The phrase sent a chill through Anne. Throughout her life, she had indeed been resistant to changes that she felt might weaken the monarchy or compromise its dignity. She had always believed that her role was to protect the institution, not to modernize it beyond recognition. Meanwhile, in the Queen's chamber, Charles was growing increasingly concerned. The meeting had been going on for over an hour, and there was still no sign of his sister. Unlike some members of the royal family, Anne was never late for important appointments. Her punctuality was as legendary as her work ethic. "I wonder where Anne is," Charles said during a brief pause in the discussion. "This isn't like her at all. Should someone check to see if she's been delayed?" Camilla, who had been leading much of the discussion about restructuring certain royal protocols, waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, I'm sure she's just caught up with some urgent matter. You know how dedicated she is to her various causes. Perhaps it's better if we continue without her for now. We can always fill her in later." Charles frowned slightly. "But these decisions directly affect her role and responsibilities. I specifically wanted her input on the proposed changes to the working royal structure." "Darling," Camilla said smoothly, "Anne has always been rather set in her ways. Sometimes it's easier to make necessary decisions first and then present them as a fait accompli. You know how she can be when she thinks changes might affect traditions." Something in Camilla's tone made Charles uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. His sister could indeed be stubborn about certain traditions, but she had also proven herself to be pragmatic when changes were truly necessary for the good of the monarchy. "I think we should wait for her," Charles said firmly. "These are significant decisions that will affect the entire family." Camilla's smile remained perfectly pleasant, but Charles caught a flicker of something in her eyes. "Of course, if that's what you prefer, though I do think we've covered the main points quite thoroughly already." Back in her office, Anne was receiving another disturbing piece of information. Her cousin, who worked in the palace's communications department, had stopped by under the pretense of discussing an upcoming charity event. But the real reason for the visit became clear quickly. "Anne, I probably shouldn't be telling you this," her cousin said quietly, "but there's been talk about restructuring the working royal roles." Your name has come up several times in these discussions, and not in a positive way. There are suggestions that perhaps some of the senior royals might consider stepping back from certain duties to make way for a streamlined approach to royal engagements. Anne felt her heart sink. Stepping back, I've never given any indication that I want to reduce my royal duties. I know, and that's what makes this so strange. The suggestions aren't coming from you, they're coming from elsewhere. People are being told that this is part of a modernization plan that has your full support, but I know you well enough to know that's not true. The picture was becoming clearer now. Someone was systematically working to marginalize her within the royal family structure, and that someone had enough influence to make significant changes without Charles apparently being fully aware of what was happening. Anne realized that her exclusion from this morning's meeting was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern, a carefully orchestrated campaign to reduce her influence and eventually push her toward a diminished role within the monarchy. The most troubling aspect was that this appeared to be happening with Charles's name attached to it, even though her instincts told her that her brother would never authorize such actions without consulting her directly. They had always been honest with each other, even when they disagreed. As afternoon approached, Anne made a decision. She would not sit passively while her life's work was undermined. If someone was using her brother's authority to marginalize her, then Charles needed to know about it immediately. But she also realized that she needed to be smart about how she approached this situation. If Camilla was indeed behind these changes, then confronting the issue directly might only accelerate whatever plans were already in motion. Anne needed evidence, and she needed allies within the palace who could help her understand exactly how deep these changes went. The princess picked up her phone and began making more calls. It was time to find out exactly what had been happening in the palace while she had been dutifully carrying out her royal responsibilities, trusting that the institution she served was being protected by those closest to the throne. By evening, Anne had gathered enough information to paint a disturbing picture of what had been happening behind the scenes. Her investigation revealed that Camilla had been holding regular meetings with key palace staff, ostensibly to discuss efficiency improvements in royal operations. However, these meetings had resulted in significant changes to protocols and procedures, many of which directly affected Anne's role and access to information. The most shocking discovery came from Sir Robert Morrison, a longtime royal advisor who had served the family for over 30 years. He visited Anne's apartment that evening, clearly troubled by what he had witnessed. "Your Royal Highness," Sir Robert began carefully, "I feel I must speak to you about something that has been weighing heavily on my conscience. Over the past few months, I have been present at several meetings where your future role has been discussed extensively." Anne gestured for him to continue, her face grave. "The Queen Consort has been advocating for what she calls a new direction for the monarchy. Part of this vision involves reducing the number of working royals to focus public attention on the direct line of succession. Your name has been mentioned repeatedly as someone who might benefit from a well-deserved retirement from public duties." Anne felt her blood pressure rising. "Retirement? I've never expressed any desire to retire. I'm in excellent health, and my public approval ratings are among the highest in the family." "I know, ma'am. That's precisely what makes this so troubling. These discussions are not based on your wishes or performance, but rather on what the Queen Consort describes as strategic positioning for the modern monarchy." Sir Robert hesitated before continuing. "There's more, I'm afraid. Today's meeting, the one you were excluded from, was specifically about implementing the first phase of these changes. Your exclusion was deliberate, and it was presented to His Majesty as your own choice." "What do you mean, my own choice?" "The Queen Consort told the King that you had expressed concerns about being overcommitted and had requested to step back from certain royal meetings to focus on your charitable work. His Majesty was told that you specifically asked not to be included in today's discussion because you felt the topics were outside your areas of interest." Anne stared at Sir Robert in disbelief. "That's completely false. I never said anything of the sort." "I know, Your Royal Highness. I was present when these claims were made, and I found them difficult to believe given your well-known dedication. But the Queen Consort was very convincing, and she had documents to support her claims." "Documents? What kind of documents?" "Apparently, there have been communications sent from your office expressing these sentiments. Of course, You would have no knowledge of them because they were never actually sent by you. The implications hit Anne like a physical blow. Someone had been forging communications in her name, creating a false narrative about her wishes and intentions. This wasn't just political maneuvering, this was outright deception. Meanwhile, Charles was in his private study, reviewing the decisions that had been made during that morning's meeting. Something continued to bother him about Anne's absence, and as he read through the proposed changes to royal duties, he realized that many of them would significantly impact his sister's role. He picked up the phone and called Anne's office, but was told she was unavailable for the evening. This struck him as odd, since Anne usually made herself available for family calls regardless of her schedule. Concerned, Charles decided to walk to Anne's apartment within the palace complex. As he approached her door, he could hear voices from within. Through the slightly open window, he caught fragments of conversation that made him pause. He heard Sir Robert's voice clearly. The Queen Consort told the king that you had requested to step back. Charles felt a cold realization wash over him. He had indeed been told that Anne wanted to reduce her involvement, but hearing it discussed this way made him suddenly question whether those communications had truly come from his sister. Rather than interrupt the conversation, Charles quietly stepped away from the door. His mind was racing with implications he didn't want to believe. Had he been deceived about his sister's wishes? Had decisions been made based on false information? Back in Anne's apartment, Sir Robert was revealing even more troubling details. There's also been discussion about gradually transferring some of your patronages to other members of the family. The suggestion is that your workload should be reduced for your own well-being, but the real effect would be to diminish your public profile significantly. Anne felt a mixture of anger and hurt that was almost overwhelming. She had devoted her entire adult life to serving the crown and the British people. Her patronages weren't just ceremonial roles to her. They were causes she cared deeply about, organizations she had helped build and sustain over decades of dedicated work. Sir Robert, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. In your opinion, does my brother know the true extent of what's been happening? Sir Robert considered the question carefully. I believe His Majesty knows that changes are being proposed, but I don't think he fully understands the scope or the methods being used to implement them. The Queen Consort has been very skillful in presenting these changes as responses to your own requests and concerns rather than as her own initiatives. So Charles thinks I want these changes. I believe so, yes. And given his respect for your judgment and his desire to support what he believes are your wishes, he's been approving measures that he might otherwise question. Anne stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the palace gardens where she had played as a child with Charles and their brothers. The irony wasn't lost on her that the institution she had spent her life protecting might now be the source of the greatest betrayal she had ever experienced. Sir Robert, I need you to help me understand exactly what was decided in today's meeting. Every detail, every decision, every timeline that was discussed. As Sir Robert began to outline the specifics of what had been planned for Anne's future, she realized that she was facing the fight of her life. But she also knew that she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the integrity of the monarchy itself, and for her brother's right to make decisions based on truth rather than carefully crafted deceptions. The next morning brought fresh challenges for Anne. When she arrived at her office, she found that her access to certain palace computer systems had been restricted. Her assistant informed her that there had been technical issues that required her passwords to be reset, but the new passwords had not yet been provided. Anne recognized this as another piece of the puzzle. By restricting her access to information systems, someone was ensuring that she couldn't easily investigate what had been happening or communicate effectively with her network of contacts within the royal household. But Anne hadn't survived decades in the royal family without learning how to navigate palace politics. She had cultivated relationships throughout the organization, from senior advisors to long-serving staff members who remembered when she was a young princess learning her royal duties. Her breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Helen Davies, who had worked in the palace communications department for 25 years, requested a private meeting. Helen had always been fond of Anne, remembering how the princess had personally intervened years ago when Helen's son needed medical treatment that the family couldn't afford. "Your Royal Highness," Helen said nervously, I shouldn't be telling you this, but my conscience won't let me stay silent anymore. I've been asked to prepare communications that go out under your name, but I know you never approved them. Anne leaned forward intently. What kind of communications? Letters to your patronages explaining that you're considering stepping back from some of your responsibilities. Memos to palace staff about changes to your schedule and priorities. Even responses to invitations that decline engagements you would normally accept. Helen reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder. I made copies because something felt wrong about the whole thing. These are documents I was told to send out as if they came from your office, but I've worked with your correspondence for years, and the tone is all wrong. Anne reviewed the documents with growing horror. They painted a picture of a princess who was tired, overwhelmed, and eager to reduce her royal duties. The language was carefully crafted to sound reasonable and even admirable, framing her supposed desire to step back as a mature recognition of her limitations. Helen, who gave you these instructions? They came through the Queen Consort's office, but I was told they were based on your direct requests. When I asked to confirm with your office, I was told that you preferred to handle these matters through alternative channels to avoid any confusion. Anne realized that Camilla had created an entire parallel communication system that bypassed her completely while using her name and authority. It was a sophisticated operation that had been running for months without her knowledge. Is there more? Helen nodded reluctantly. There's a master plan document that outlines a timeline for your gradual withdrawal from public duties over the next 18 months. It includes specific dates for announcing your retirement from various patronages and a schedule for transferring your responsibilities to other royals. The document Helen showed her was professionally prepared and detailed. It outlined not just what would happen, but when and how it would be presented to the public. Anne's retirement was portrayed as a natural evolution that would allow younger royals to take on greater responsibilities while honoring her decades of service. What made it particularly insidious was how reasonable it all sounded. The public would likely view it as a dignified transition for a senior royal who had earned the right to a more peaceful life. They would never suspect that it was being imposed against her will. That afternoon, Anne made a decision that would prove to be the turning point in this entire situation. Instead of confronting Camilla directly or trying to prove the deception through official channels, she decided to create her own test. She instructed Helen to prepare a fake document, supposedly from Anne's office, announcing her intention to take on additional responsibilities and expand her role within certain royal foundations. If this document was intercepted and suppressed, it would prove that her communications were being monitored and controlled. The trap worked exactly as Anne had hoped. Within hours of Helen submitting the document through normal palace channels, Anne received a phone call from one of Camilla's senior staff members, expressing concern about the princess's apparent change of heart regarding her workload. "We're surprised by this development," the caller said diplomatically. "Given your recent expressions of interest in reducing your commitments, this seems inconsistent with your stated goals." Anne played her part perfectly. "I'm not sure what you mean. I haven't expressed any interest in reducing my commitments. In fact, I'm more energized than ever about my royal duties." The silence on the other end of the phone was telling. The caller eventually stammered something about possible miscommunication and ended the call abruptly. That evening, Anne received an unexpected visitor. Charles arrived at her apartment, looking troubled and confused. For the first time since this ordeal began, brother and sister were face to face. "Anne, I need to ask you something directly," Charles said without preamble. "Have you been having second thoughts about your royal responsibilities? I've been receiving reports that you're interested in stepping back from some of your duties, but when I think about it, it doesn't sound like you at all." Anne looked at her brother, seeing the genuine concern in his eyes. This was the moment she had been waiting for, but she also knew that how she handled it could determine not just her own future, but the future relationship between Charles and Camilla. "Charles, I need to show you something," Anne said carefully. "But before I do, I need you to promise me that you'll listen to the entire explanation before making any judgments." Charles nodded, settling into the familiar chair where they had shared countless conversations over the years about family matters, royal duties, and the challenges of public life. Anne began to lay out everything she had discovered, showing him the forged documents, explaining about the restricted access to palace systems and detailing the systematic campaign that had been waged to marginalize her influence. She was careful to present facts rather than accusations, letting her brother draw his own conclusions about who was responsible. As the evidence mounted, Charles's expression shifted from confusion to concern to anger. When Anne finished her presentation, he sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Charles stared at the documents spread across Anne's coffee table, his face pale with shock and growing anger. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. His sister, one of the most dedicated members of the royal family, had been systematically undermined and deceived in his name. "Anne, I had no idea," he said quietly, his voice heavy with both guilt and fury. "When I was told about your supposed desire to step back, I was actually proud of you for recognizing your own needs. I thought it showed maturity and self-awareness." "I know you did," Anne replied gently. "That's what makes this so insidious. The person behind this understood exactly how to manipulate your good intentions and your respect for my judgment." Charles picked up one of the forged documents, studying the letterhead and signature. "This looks completely authentic. How long has this been going on?" "Based on what I've discovered, at least 6 months, maybe longer." Anne showed him Helen's folder of copied communications. "Look at these dates. There's been a steady stream of communications supposedly from me, all designed to create a narrative that I was becoming less committed to my royal duties." Charles read through several of the documents, his anger growing with each page. "Some of these mention conversations we supposedly had about your concerns, conversations that never actually took place." "That's the most troubling part," Anne agreed. "Not only were false documents created in my name, but false memories were being created about our private conversations. You were being told that I had confided things to you that I never actually said." Charles stood up abruptly and began packing the room. "This isn't just deception about your role. This is manipulation of my judgment as king. If someone can convince me that my own sister said things she never said, what else might I be believing that isn't true?" Anne watched her brother grapple with the implications. She could see the moment when he realized that this wasn't just about her situation, but about the integrity of his decision-making process as monarch. "Charles, there's something else you need to know," Anne said carefully. "Yesterday's meeting, the one I was barred from attending, what decisions were made?" Charles looked uncomfortable. "We discussed the restructuring of working royal duties. The plan is to announce your gradual transition to a more ceremonial role, starting with reducing your patronages by about half." "And when was this announcement supposed to be made?" "Next week. We were going to present it as your own decision, emphasizing your wisdom in recognizing when it was time to step back." Anne felt a chill. "Charles, I would never have agreed to that. Those patronages aren't just titles to me, they're organizations I've worked with for decades, causes I genuinely care about." Charles sank back into his chair, the full weight of what had happened settling over him. "Anne, I'm so sorry. I've been completely deceived, and in the process, I've been about to publicly humiliate you and undermine everything you've worked for." "The question now is what we do about it," Anne said pragmatically. "This isn't just about correcting a misunderstanding. Someone has been actively working to manipulate the monarchy from within. We need to understand how deep this goes and ensure it can't happen again." That evening, Charles requested a private meeting with Camilla. He arrived at her study carrying a briefcase containing all the evidence Anne had shown him. His wife greeted him with her usual warm smile, but Charles noticed that she seemed slightly nervous. "Darling, you look troubled," Camilla said, moving to pour him a drink. "Has something happened?" Charles set the briefcase on her desk and opened it, removing the stack of documents. "I need to ask you about some communications that have been going out in Anne's name." Camilla glanced at the papers, and Charles caught a flicker of something in her expression before she composed herself. "I'm not sure what you mean. What kind of communications?" Charles showed her one of the forged documents. "This letter, supposedly from Anne to one of her charitable organizations, explaining that she's considering stepping back from her role as patron. The problem is, Anne never wrote this letter." "Well, perhaps there was some miscommunication in her office," Camilla suggested. "You know how busy she is. Maybe her staff misunderstood her intentions." Charles shook his head. "No, Camilla, this isn't a misunderstanding. Someone has been systematically creating false communications in my sister's name, and those communications have been used to justify decisions that affect her entire future. Camilla's demeanor shifted slightly, becoming more defensive. Charles, I think you may be overreacting. Palace communications can be complicated, and sometimes things get lost in translation. Like Anne's exclusion from yesterday's meeting, Charles asked pointedly. I was told that she had requested not to participate because she felt overwhelmed by her responsibilities, but she never made any such request. The room fell silent as Charles waited for Camilla's response. When it came, her voice was cooler than before. Charles, I think Anne may be feeling threatened by the necessary changes we've been implementing. The monarchy needs to modernize, and sometimes that means making difficult decisions about roles and responsibilities. Modernizing doesn't require deception, Charles replied firmly, and it certainly doesn't require forging communications from family members. Camilla stood up, her composure finally cracking slightly. I've been trying to protect you from having to make these difficult decisions yourself. Anne has been resistant to change, and sometimes the only way to implement necessary reforms is to present them as accomplished facts. Charles stared at his wife, hardly believing what he was hearing. So you admit that you've been deceiving both Anne and me. I've been trying to modernize an institution that desperately needs updating, Camilla said, her voice rising slightly. Anne represents the old way of doing things. She's too set in her traditions to see that the monarchy needs to evolve. Charles felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of his marriage and his reign. Camilla, what you've done isn't modernization, it's manipulation. You've used my trust in you to undermine my sister and compromise my judgment as king. The conversation continued for another hour, growing more heated as the full extent of Camilla's involvement became clear. She had indeed orchestrated a comprehensive campaign to marginalize Anne, believing that reducing the number of prominent working royals would focus more attention on the direct line of succession and enhance her own position as queen consort. By the end of their discussion, Charles realized that his marriage had been built on his complete trust in Camilla's judgment, and that trust had been systematically abused to pursue an agenda he had never fully understood or approved. The following morning, Charles called for an emergency meeting with his senior advisors, but this time, he personally ensured that Anne was not only invited, but was the first to be notified. He also made it clear that any future royal meetings would require his direct approval for attendance, removing the possibility of similar exclusions. When Anne entered the Queen's chamber, she noticed immediate changes. The seating arrangement had been altered so that she sat directly across from Charles, in a position that clearly indicated her status as his primary advisor. Camilla was present, but her chair had been moved to a less prominent position. Before we begin, Charles announced to the room, I need to address some serious issues that have come to light regarding palace communications and decision-making processes. What followed was one of the most uncomfortable meetings in recent royal history. Charles systematically exposed the deception that had been perpetrated, showing the forged documents and explaining how false information had been used to justify decisions that would have fundamentally altered Anne's role. The senior advisors, many of whom had been unaware of the full scope of the manipulation, listened in stunned silence. Sir Robert Morrison, who had helped Anne uncover the truth, provided additional context about how the false narrative had been built over months of carefully crafted communications. Effective immediately, Charles declared, all communications that go out in the name of any member of the royal family must be directly approved by that family member. No exceptions. Additionally, any decisions regarding the roles and responsibilities of working royals must involve direct consultation with the affected individuals. Camilla remained silent throughout most of the meeting, her face carefully composed but her discomfort obvious to everyone present. When Charles finally asked if she had anything to say, her response was brief and defensive. I believed I was acting in the best interests of the monarchy, she said stiffly. Perhaps my methods were flawed, but my intentions were to strengthen the institution. Anne spoke for the first time since the meeting began. The strength of the monarchy has always come from the trust between family members and the integrity of our communications with the public. When that trust is broken, the institution itself is weakened. The meeting concluded with Charles announcing that all decisions made based on false information would be reversed immediately. Anne's patronages would remain unchanged. Her role as a senior working royal would be reaffirmed, and new protocols would be established to prevent similar deceptions in the future. But the personal consequences of what had been revealed extended far beyond palace protocols. That evening, Charles and Camilla had their most serious conversation since their marriage. "I don't know how we come back from this," Charles said quietly. They were in their private sitting room, but the atmosphere was anything but intimate. "Charles, please understand that everything I did was because I love you and want to see you succeed as king," Camilla pleaded. "Yes, my methods were wrong, but I was genuinely trying to help." "You weren't helping me," Charles replied firmly. "You were pursuing your own vision of what the monarchy should be, and you used deception and manipulation to achieve it. Worse, you made me complicit in undermining my own sister." Camilla tried to reach for his hand, but Charles pulled away. "I never meant to hurt Anne. I just thought that streamlining the royal family would make your reign more effective." "But it wasn't your decision to make," Charles said. "And the way you went about it has damaged not just Anne's trust, but my ability to trust my own judgment. How can I be certain that any of the advice I receive from you is honest and straightforward?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswered because they both knew there was no easy response. In the weeks that followed, the royal family began the difficult process of rebuilding trust and establishing new protocols to prevent similar incidents. Anne returned to her full schedule of royal duties with renewed energy, her commitment to the monarchy stronger than ever despite what she had endured. The public never learned the full details of what had happened, but those close to the royal family noticed subtle changes. Charles and Anne were seen together more frequently at official events, their partnership as senior royals more visible and collaborative than it had been in years. Camilla's role evolved as well, though not in the way she had originally planned. She continued as queen consort, but her influence on major royal decisions was significantly reduced. The trust that had once characterized her relationship with Charles was replaced by a more formal, protocol-driven partnership. The most lasting impact of the crisis was on the systems and structures that governed royal communications and decision-making. New oversight mechanisms were put in place to ensure transparency and prevent any single individual from wielding unchecked influence over royal family affairs. Anne reflected on the experience during a rare quiet evening in her apartment several months later. She had always known that palace life involved complex political dynamics, but she had never imagined that the greatest threat to her position would come from within the heart of the royal family itself. What struck her most was not the betrayal itself, but how easily it might have succeeded. If not for the loyalty of longtime staff members like Helen Davies and Sir Robert Morrison, and if not for Charles's willingness to listen and investigate when presented with evidence, her entire life's work might have been quietly dismantled without the public ever knowing what had really happened. The experience reinforced her belief that the strength of the monarchy lay not in its ability to evolve and modernize, but in its commitment to the fundamental principles of duty, integrity, and service that had sustained it through centuries of change. Those principles could not be compromised, even in the name of progress, without risking the very foundation of the institution itself. As she looked out at the palace gardens where she had played as a child, Anne felt a renewed sense of purpose. The monarchy had weathered this internal crisis and emerged stronger, but constant vigilance would be required to ensure that the lessons learned were never forgotten.